Madam Speaker, former Speaker, before we discuss reforming insider trading laws, I need to inform you that as of 6:00 a.m. this morning, you and your husband, Paul Pelosi, are subjects of an FBI criminal investigation for securities fraud, insider trading, wire fraud, money laundering, and operating a criminal enterprise under the RICO statute. FBI Deputy Director Dan Bonino's words detonated in the House Financial Services Committee hearing room like a precisely placed explosive charge. Surgical, devastating, irreversible. Nancy Pelosi, 84 years old, 38 years in Congress. The former Speaker of the House, third in line for the presidency, simply froze. Not with the panicked shock of a young politician caught off guard. This was different. This was the momentary paralysis of a master strategist who'd just realized she'd walked into a trap. Her hand, raised mid-gesture, to emphasize whatever point she'd been making about restoring public trust in congressional ethics, slowly lowered to the table. Her face, famously difficult to read after decades of high-stakes political poker, showed nothing. But her eyes darted once to the exits, then to her attorney, and then back to Bonino. The hearing room held maybe 200 people: reporters, congressional staff, lobbyists, political observers, and C-SPAN cameras. In the half-second before chaos erupted, there was perfect silence. The kind of silence that occurs when everyone simultaneously realizes they're witnessing history. Then the room exploded. Reporters began shouting questions. Camera operators scrambled for better angles. Congressional aides grabbed their phones. Committee members, both Democrats and Republicans, looked genuinely shocked. This wasn't planned political theater. This was real. Mr. Chairman Pelosi's voice cut through the chaos with the authority of someone who'd controlled rooms like this for 4 decades. This is outrageous. This is a transparently political persecution by an FBI that has been weaponized by— "Ma'am," Bonino interrupted, his voice carrying that flat, professional tone of a cop who done this 1,000 times. "You have the right to have legal counsel present during questioning. You have the right to decline to answer questions that might incriminate you under the Fifth Amendment. Do you understand these rights as I've explained them?" Chairman Patrick McHenry was banging his gavel, trying unsuccessfully to restore order. Democrats were on their feet protesting. Republicans sat frozen, some barely suppressing expressions of vindication. Twitter was probably already on fire. "You're reading me my rights?" Pelosi's famous composure cracked slightly. "I am. I was the Speaker of the House. I am third in line for— You were third in line for the presidency." Bongino corrected calmly, "Past tense. Now, you're a person of interest in a criminal investigation into what FBI forensics indicates is the most profitable insider trading scheme in congressional history." He opened a red folder stamped FBI evidence and pulled out a document. It appeared on screens throughout the hearing room, a stock transaction record. On December 20th, 2021, you attended a closed, classified briefing of the House Ways and Means Committee regarding the CHIPS and Science Act semiconductor legislation that would ultimately authorize $52 billion in government subsidies. This was a classified briefing because it contained sensitive national security information about U.S. technological competition with China. Bongino pulled out another document, phone records. At 6:43 p.m. that same evening, 28 minutes after that classified briefing ended, you called your husband, Paul Pelosi. The call lasted 7 minutes. 3 days later, on December 23rd, Paul Pelosi purchased $5 million in NVIDIA call options through his Charles Schwab brokerage account. He displayed the actual trade confirmation on the screens. NVIDIA, for those who might not know, is America's leading manufacturer of semiconductors used in artificial intelligence applications. The CHIPS Act was designed specifically to benefit companies like NVIDIA by providing massive government subsidies for domestic semiconductor production. Bongino pulled out a timeline chart. On February 4, 2022, the CHIPS Act passed the House. March 15th, it passed the Senate. April 8th, it was signed into law. And over those 4 months, as the legislation moved through Congress and became public, NVIDIA stock surged. On June 17, 2022, Paul Pelosi sold those options. Sale price, $7.3 million. His profit on that single trade, $2.3 million. He let that number sit in the air. That's $2.3 million in profit from a trade made 3 days after you learned classified information about legislation that would directly benefit the company he invested in. That's not shrewd investing, Madam Speaker. That's securities fraud. That's insider trading. That's a violation of the Stock Act. And that's a federal crime, carrying up to 20 years in prison. Pelosi's attorney, a high-powered Washington lawyer charging $1,500 an hour, was frantically whispering in her ear. Her communications director was typing furiously. The Democratic members of the committee were shouting about political witch hunts and partisan FBI. But Bongino wasn't done. And that's just one trade. Madam Speaker, FBI forensic analysis has identified 347 stock trades executed by you and your husband over the past 15 years that show suspicious timing relative to classified congressional briefings and committee work. 347 trades, total value $180 million. Total profits, based on what we assess as insider information, $87 million. He pulled out a comprehensive chart showing years of trades mapped against Pelosi's committee assignments and classified briefings. 89% of these trades occurred within 2 weeks of you receiving classified information or participating in confidential congressional business that would affect the stock prices of the companies your husband traded. 89%. Bongino looked directly at Pelosi. FBI forensic statisticians calculate that the probability of this timing being coincidental is approximately 1 in 847 million. This wasn't lucky investing. This was systematic exploitation of classified information for personal financial gain. This was a criminal enterprise. And that's why, as of this morning, both you and your husband are under investigation for violations of securities laws, the Stock Act, wire fraud statutes, money laundering laws, and the RICO Act. The hearing room was in absolute pandemonium. Now, CNN had cut to breaking news. Fox News was running Pelosi under FBI investigation. Kieran's MSNBC looked shell-shocked. The stock market had probably already reacted. You have been reading my private financial records. Pelosi's voice rose, indignation mixing with fear. My husband's private trades. This is surveillance of a sitting member of Congress. Former Speaker, Bongino corrected again. And yes, we've examined your financial records. That's what the FBI does when we have probable cause that securities laws have been violated. We obtained court-authorized warrants. We subpoenaed trading records. We analyzed patterns. We followed the money. That's our job. He pulled out more documents. These heavily redacted but still readable. And we didn't start by surveilling you. We started by investigating suspicious trading patterns that were flagged by the Securities and Exchange Commission. They noticed that trades in your husband's accounts had an average annual return of 47% over the past 15 years. 47% per year. Warren Buffett averages 20%. The S&P 500 averages 10%. Nobody legitimately averages 47% without inside information. Bongino's voice took on a harder edge. So the SEC referred the matter to the FBI. And when we started analyzing the timing of those trades against your congressional calendar, your committee assignments, your classified briefings, your legislative work, the pattern became undeniable. Your husband wasn't making investment decisions. He was trading on classified information you provided. And the two of you weren't just breaking securities laws. You were operating a criminal enterprise. He pulled out phone records, emails, text messages, all obtained through court-authorized warrants. We have communications between you and your husband explicitly discussing trades immediately after classified briefings. We have emails where you describe legislative outcomes before they're public. We have text messages where you tell him exactly what to buy and when to sell. We have you on tape telling him that antitrust regulations are coming for tech companies days before those regulations were announced. We have recorded phone calls where he tells his broker, "My wife says specific information that hadn't been made public yet." Bongino closed the folder with a decisive snap. You spent 38 years in Congress. You were Speaker of the House, one of the most powerful positions in American government. You had access to classified information that could move markets, and you used that access systematically and deliberately to enrich yourself and your husband. You made $87 million by betraying your oath of office. He leaned forward slightly. So when you talk about restoring trust in congressional ethics, Madam Speaker, I'd suggest the first step would be holding members of Congress accountable when they commit crimes. And that's exactly what this investigation is about. Nancy Pelosi sat perfectly still in her chair. Decades of political experience had taught her never to show weakness, but even she couldn't completely hide the calculation happening behind her eyes. She was assessing the evidence, measuring her exposure, and planning her defense. "You're going to need lawyers," Bongino stated matter-of-factly. "Very expensive lawyers, very good lawyers, because what I've just described is solely the NVIDIA trade. We haven't discussed Apple yet, or Tesla, or Microsoft, or Alphabet, or the real estate purchases, or the shell companies, or the money laundering," when suddenly Mr. Chairman Pelosi's attorney was on his feet. "My client will not be answering any further questions without counsel present," he declared. "We request an immediate recess." Denied. Chairman McHenry's voice carried an edge that suggested he was thoroughly enjoying this. Deputy Director Bongino had been invited to testify about the FBI's investigations into congressional insider trading, and he was testifying. Former Speaker Pelosi chose to participate in this hearing. She would hear what he had to say. McHenry looked at Bongino with barely concealed satisfaction. "Deputy Director, please continue," McHenry prompted. "You mentioned Apple." Dan Bongino smiled, the cold, professional smile of a cop who'd spent 25 years building cases and knew exactly when he had an airtight prosecution. "Yes, Mr. Chairman, I mentioned Apple," Bongino affirmed. "And this is going to take a while." He had 8 more folders lying on the table in front of him. All of them bore Nancy Pelosi's name, and every single one contained evidence of crimes. Bongino then opened his second folder with deliberate precision. Inside lay 15 years of trading records, each meticulously tagged with dates, amounts, and corresponding congressional activities. "Let's talk about Apple, Madam Speaker," he continued, "because Apple is truly where the pattern becomes undeniable. Between 2007 and 2024, your husband executed 47 separate trades involving either Apple stock or Apple options. That's 47 trades spanning 17 years, with a total volume of $63 million and a total profit of $124 million. He then pulled out a large timeline chart and displayed it across all the screens. But it's not simply the number of trades that truly matters here. No, it's the impeccable timing. Allow me to walk you through some specific examples, and I want both the committee and the American people watching to pay close attention to this emerging pattern. The first example Bongino presented dates back to June 2010. Nancy had attended a classified Energy and Commerce Committee briefing focusing on proposed green technology subsidies. This briefing detailed how smartphone adoption was driving demand for clean energy solutions and how companies like Apple stood to significantly benefit from upcoming legislation. Just 4 days later, Paul Pelosi purchased $3.2 million in Apple stock at $250 per share. This purchase occurred right before the iPhone 4 launch and immediately preceding the public announcement of that green tech subsidy legislation. When the subsidy legislation ultimately passed in August 2010, Apple stock surged to $289. Paul then sold in September, netting a profit of $427,000. Our second example brings us to September 2012. Nancy participated in yet another classified briefing, this one concerning potential trade sanctions against China in response to intellectual property theft. The briefing specifically highlighted how these proposed sanctions could significantly affect Apple's manufacturing operations in China. Only 3 days later, Paul purchased $2.8 million in Apple put options, essentially betting that Apple stock would decline. This was highly unusual, especially since Apple had been surging throughout the entire year. When the trade sanctions were publicly announced on September 20th, investors immediately panicked over Apple's significant China exposure. The stock subsequently dropped 11% in just 3 days. Paul's put options, of course, surged dramatically in value. He sold on October 2nd, securing a profit of $1.2 million. Our third crucial example comes from March 2015. Nancy attended a closed session of the Judiciary Committee, this time regarding potential antitrust investigations into tech monopolies. The discussion was classified because the DOJ hadn't yet announced which specific companies were being investigated, but the committee was explicitly briefed that Apple, Google, Amazon, and Facebook were all primary targets. Only 5 days later, Paul again sold short $3.4 million in Apple stock, clearly betting the stock would decline. When the DOJ finally announced the antitrust investigations on April 7th, tech stocks across the board plummeted. Apple itself dropped a sharp 8%. Paul covered his short position on April 15th, yielding a profit of $673,000. Bongino looked up from his documents. "Are we seeing the pattern yet?" he asked pointedly. Nancy attends a classified briefing. Paul trades days later. Nancy learns information that will move the stock. Paul profits. This exact scenario unfolded over and over and over again. He then pulled out a comprehensive chart, meticulously detailing all 47 Apple trades. "Let me show you just how incredibly consistent this pattern truly is," he pressed. This chart, laid bare before you, shows every single Apple trade Paul Pelosi made between 2007 and 2024. The red dots, as you can see, represent the trades. The blue bars mark Nancy Pelosi's classified briefings or committee sessions, each one involving information that would directly affect Apple. The chart, quite simply, was damning. Nearly every single red dot appeared within mere days of a blue bar. A staggering 89% of Paul's Apple trades occurred within 2 weeks of Nancy receiving classified information directly relevant to Apple. 89%. That, Mr. Chairman, is not investing skill. And that is certainly not market research. That, right there, is insider trading. Bongino then held up printed emails, which were obtained legally through court-authorized search warrants. But we don't have to rely on just circumstantial evidence about the timing. We have the direct proof. These are emails exchanged between Nancy and Paul Pelosi, recovered directly from their personal email accounts. He put the first email up on the screen for everyone to see. It was sent from Nancy's official congressional email address to Paul's personal account on March 18, 2015, at 7:42 p.m., with the subject line, Committee News. Nancy wrote, quote, "Antitrust issues coming for FANG, that's Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google. The DOJ briefed us today. An investigation is starting within 3 weeks. This isn't public information yet. Position yourself accordingly. This news is going to move the markets." Paul replied less than an hour later. Apple puts, "How heavy?" Nancy's response came just 6 minutes after that. "Very heavy. This is going to be really bad for them. Think in the $3 to $4 million range." The entire hearing room was dead silent. Even the Democrats, who had been shouting about political persecution, now looked uncomfortable. "That is Nancy Pelosi," Bongino said, pointing at the screen, "explicitly telling her husband about classified DOJ antitrust investigations before they're public. Explicitly telling him to buy put options, and explicitly telling him how much to invest. And then he pocketed $673,000 when that classified information became public and moved the market. He pulled out more emails. Here's another one, dated June 12, 2019. It was also from Nancy's congressional email. The subject line this time, Privacy Regs. Big tech privacy regulations are coming. The FTC is voting next week. Apple is going to get hit the hardest. They fought against the regulations and lost. Their stock will drop when it's announced. Paul, you know what to do." Bongino then turned to the trade records. On June 17, 2019, Paul buys Apple puts. On June 20th, the FTC announces the new privacy regulations. Apple's stock drops 6%. And on June 25th, Paul sells. His profit was $840,000. He then presented a third email, sent on December 8, 2020, at 8:15 p.m. The subject was, "Good news. The antitrust settlement is better than we expected. The DOJ is backing down. This won't go public until next week, but Apple is going to surge when it's announced. Load up on call options. Trust me on this one." Bongino then displayed the trade that corresponded with this email. On December 9, 2020, Paul buys $4.3 million worth of Apple call options. On December 15th, the DOJ announces that favorable antitrust settlement. Apple stock surges 9%. And on December 22nd, Paul sells for a profit of $2.3 million. But then he pulled out one more email. This one was particularly damning, sent on March 15, 2021, at 9:47 p.m. The subject line was simply, "Jackpot. The infrastructure bill is passing next month. The green energy provisions I wrote into it specifically benefit companies that have mobile device battery technology. Apple is positioned perfectly for this. This is going to be a complete windfall for Apple stock. I structured the legislation specifically to maximize their benefits. Buy heavy. This is insider information at its finest. LOL." Bongino let that one just sit on the screen for a long moment. "I structured the legislation to maximize their benefits," he read aloud. "This is insider information at its finest. LOL." That is Nancy Pelosi, in her own words, admitting she wrote legislation to benefit a company her husband was invested in, and then explicitly describing it as insider information. He then looked directly at Pelosi. "Madam Speaker, you didn't just trade on inside information. You created inside information by writing legislation that was designed to move stocks you were already invested in. That's not just insider trading. That is corruption of the entire legislative process for personal profit. But wait, there's more, Bongino said as he pulled out an audio playback device. The FBI obtained court authorization to monitor Paul Pelosi's communications with his stockbroker, right after the SEC flagged some suspicious trading patterns. These recordings you're about to hear are from June 2019, right after Nancy attended that classified FTC briefing about the privacy regulations. He then pressed play. Paul Pelosi's voice suddenly filled the hearing room. "Tom, I need to make some moves in my account." His broker, Tom Hansen, replied, "Sure, Paul. What are you thinking?" "I need to short Apple. A heavy position, around 3 million. Short Apple? Paul, Apple's been on a tear." "Why would you do that?" Paul interrupted him. "My wife says privacy regulations are coming down from the FTC. She says they're going to hammer the tech companies, and that Apple is going to get hit the hardest. She was in a briefing about it just yesterday." "That briefing? That was classified, wasn't it?" "Yeah, but she tells me everything. This is going to move the stock. I need to have the position in place before the announcement." The broker then tried to warn him. "Paul, I have to advise you that trading on classified congressional information is—" But Paul just cut him off. "Tom, I've been doing this for 15 years. Just execute the trade. Nancy knows what she's doing. We've made millions this way." Phong Xuan lại một lần nữa ồn ào. Đó là Paul Pelosi công khai thừa nhận trên băng ghi âm rằng ông đã giao dịch dựa trên thông tin mắc mà vợ ông cung cấp trong suốt 15 năm. Bongino dừng đoạn băng. "Nancy biết cô ấy đang làm gì. Chúng tôi đã kiếm hàng triệu theo cách này." Đó là Paul Pelosi trên băng ghi âm mô tả một hoạt động giao dịch nội gián có hệ thống đã diễn ra trong 15 năm. Và hãy để ý phản ứng của môi giới. Người môi giới biết điều này là bất hợp pháp và đã cố cảnh báo ông. Paul không quan tâm. Ông nói, và tôi trích dẫn, "Tôi đã làm điều này 15 năm rồi." Bongino lấy ra một báo cáo phân tích pháp y toàn diện do các nhà phân tích tài chính của FBI chuẩn bị. Bộ phận tội phạm tài chính của FBI đã tiến hành phân tích thống kê giao dịch cổ phiếu Apple của Paul Pelosi. "Chúng tôi mới so sánh lợi nhuận của ông ấy với mức trung bình của thị trường, với các nhà đầu tư tinh vi khác và với xác suất ngẫu nhiên. Kết quả là thuyết phục." Ông trình bày một biểu đồ cho thấy lợi nhuận từ cổ phiếu Apple của Paul so với các tiêu chuẩn khác nhau. Từ năm 2007 đến 2020, các giao dịch cổ phiếu Apple của Paul Pelosi đã tạo ra mức lợi nhuận hàng năm trung bình là 52% mỗi năm. S&P 500 trung bình 11% trong giai đoạn đó. Các quỹ phòng hộ chuyên nghiệp trung bình 18%. Warren Buffett được cho là nhà đầu tư vĩ đại nhất trong lịch sử, trung bình 22%. Bongino chỉ vào biểu đồ. Không ai đánh bại thị trường 30 điểm phần trăm năm này qua năm khác mà không có thông tin nội bộ. Điều đó là không thể về mặt thống kê. Các nhà phân tích của chúng tôi tính toán rằng xác suất Paul đạt được những lợi nhuận này thông qua giao dịch hợp pháp là ít hơn 1 trên 50 triệu. Ông lấy ra một phân tích khác, nhưng đây mới là phần thực sự đáng lên án. Chúng tôi đã phân tích hiệu suất giao dịch của Paul đối với các cổ phiếu mà Nancy không có thông tin mất hoặc quyền hạn ủy ban. Lợi nhuận của ông ấy từ những cổ phiếu đó là 8%, hơi thấp hơn mức trung bình của thị trường. Ông ấy không phải là một nhà đầu tư tinh vi. Ông ấy là một nhà đầu tư bình thường trở thành thiên tài khi vợ ông ấy cung cấp cho ông thông tin mật. Luật sư của Pelosi cố gắng ngắt lời. "Thưa Chủ tịch, đây là sự suy đoán rất có thành kiến. Đó không phải là suy đoán," Bongino cất lời. "Đó là phân tích tài chính pháp y được hỗ trợ bởi 15 năm dữ liệu giao dịch, lịch trình giao ban mất, thông tin liên lạc qua email và các cuộc gọi điện thoại đã ghi âm. Chồng của thân chủ của quý vị đã thừa nhận trên băng ghi âm rằng ông ấy đã giao dịch dựa trên thông tin mật của cô ấy trong 15 năm. Bằng chứng là quá rõ ràng. Ông đóng tập hồ sơ Apple lại và lấy ra một cái khác, và đó mới chỉ là Apple. Chúng ta nên nói về Tesla bây giờ hay cứu chủ tịch muốn viện dẫn quyền sửa đổi thứ 5 của mình trước khi chúng ta tiếp tục? Pelosi ngồi bất động. Bản năng chính trị huyền thoại của cô cuối cùng đã thất bại. Cô đã dành 38 năm ở Quốc hội để vượt qua các vụ bê bối, đánh bại đối thủ, củng cố quyền lực. Nhưng cô chưa từng đối mặt với điều gì như thế này. Dan Bongino đã có bằng chứng. Tất cả chúng, thưa bà Chủ tịch, ông khẽ nói, quý vị đã phạm tội. Những tội ác có hệ thống, có chủ ý, kéo dài. Và bây giờ, quý vị sẽ phải chịu trách nhiệm. Ông mở tập hồ sơ tiếp theo. Hãy thảo luận về Tesla và các khoản trợ cấp năng lượng xanh mà quý vị đích thân viết vào luật, trong khi chồng quý vị được định vị để hưởng lợi từ chúng. Hãy nói về xe điện, thưa bà Chủ tịch. Bongino bắt đầu mở tập hồ sơ thứ 3 của mình. Bởi vì đây là lúc trở nên rõ ràng rằng quý vị không chỉ giao dịch bằng thông tin nội bộ, quý vị đã tích cực viết luật được thiết kế để mang lại lợi ích cho các công ty mà quý vị và chồng quý vị đã đầu tư. Ông lấy ra các dự thảo luật mạng, những ghi chú viết tay của Nancy Pelosi ở lễ. Giữa năm 2019 và 2022, quý vị là một trong những kiến trúc sư chính của luật năng lượng xanh, luật đầu tư và việc làm cơ sở hạ tầng, các phần của luật giảm lạm phát. Những dự luật này chứa hàng tỷ đô la trợ cấp cho xe điện, cơ sở hạ tầng sắt và công nghệ pin. Bongino hiển thị một bản sao dự thảo luật trên màn hình. Đây là một dự thảo làm việc của dự luật cơ sở hạ tầng từ tháng 4 năm 2021. Đó là chữ viết tay của quý vị ở lễ, đúng chứ? Ông chỉ vào các ghi chú được viết ngoét ngoạc dọc theo một số phần. Để tôi đọc một số ghi chú của quý vị. Mục 12C. Tăng tín dụng thuế EV lên 12.500 USD. Tesla hưởng lợi nhiều nhất. Mục 8B quỹ cơ sở hạ tầng sắt. ChargePoint được định vị tốt. Mục 15. Kiểm tra trợ cấp công nghệ pin. Vị trí của Paul trong QS. Mục 22.2. Loại trừ yêu cầu sản xuất theo công đoàn giúp TSLA tăng lợi nhuận. Ông nhìn lên Pelosi. Quý vị thực sự đang chú thích luật với các ghi chú về cách các điều khoản cụ thể sẽ mang lại lợi ích cho các công ty mà chồng quý vị đã đầu tư. Quý vị không viết chính sách để giúp nước Mỹ chuyển đổi sang năng lượng sạch. Quý vị đang viết chính sách để thúc đẩy giá cổ phiếu trong danh mục đầu tư của mình. Bongino lấy ra hồ sơ giao dịch cổ phiếu Tesla của Paul Pelosi. Hãy truy vết tiền. Tháng 8 năm 2021, quý vị đang tích cực tham gia đàm phán dự luật cơ sở hạ tầng. Dự luật vẫn chưa được thông qua. The exact subsidy figures weren't public knowledge, but you, as the author of the legislation, were well aware that these subsidies would be a massive windfall for Tesla. And then he brought up Paul's trading records. On August 17, 2021, Paul Pelosi bought $4.2 million worth of Tesla call options. The strike price was $650, and the expiration was March 2022. This represented a huge wager that Tesla stock was about to skyrocket. Bongino then laid out the legislative timeline. In November 2021, the infrastructure bill passed, allocating $7.5 billion for EV charging infrastructure. December 2021 saw the advancement of expanded EV tax credits. In January 2022, Biden announced that the federal fleet would be transitioning to EVs. February 2022, Tesla reported record quarterly profits. He then showed Tesla's stock chart for that period, displaying a steady rise from $650 to $1,050. By March 2022, Paul Pelosi sold his Tesla call options. The sale price was $9.1 million. His initial investment had been $4.2 million. This left him with a profit of $4.9 million. Bongino let that figure hang in the air. A $4.9 million profit from legislation you personally crafted, all while knowing your husband was in a prime position to benefit. That's not public service. That's self-dealing. But Tesla wasn't the only move. Bongino continued, revealing that in September 2021, while negotiating the infrastructure bill's charging infrastructure provisions, Paul purchased $1.8 million in ChargePoint stock. ChargePoint operates America's largest EV charging network. The infrastructure bill you were writing earmarked $7.5 billion specifically for EV charging infrastructure. He then showed ChargePoint's stock performance. After the infrastructure bill passed, ChargePoint surged by 47%. Paul sold his shares in January 2022, netting a profit of $847,000. Bongino pulled out yet another set of trades. In October 2021, Paul bought $2.1 million in QuantumScape stock, a company focused on solid-state battery technology. Just 2 weeks later, you amended the infrastructure bill to include $3 billion in grants for next-generation battery technology. QuantumScape was one of only a handful of companies positioned to receive those grants. He showed the stock chart, with QuantumScape surging 63% after the bill passed. Paul sold in February 2022, making a profit of $1.3 million. Bongino then produced an email that would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. "But we don't have to infer intent," he stated. "We have Nancy Pelosi's own words." He displayed the email across all screens. It was dated October 15, 2021, sent at 11:34 p.m., with the subject line, Infrastructure Bill Update. Nancy had written to Paul, "The EV subsidies are definitely going through. I wrote the provisions to maximize benefits for the companies you're positioned in. Tesla gets the biggest boost from the tax credit structure. ChargePoint gets priority for infrastructure grants because of how I structured the eligibility requirements. I've been negotiating for months to make sure these provisions survive. They will. This is going to move these stocks significantly when it passes. You're positioned perfectly. This might be our biggest score yet. $4 million in Tesla should turn into over $9 million by March. I'm not just providing you inside information anymore. I'm literally writing the legislation to move the stocks we own. This is why I fought so hard to become Speaker. We should discuss what to do with the profits. The Napa property needs renovation. Love, NPS. Delete this after reading." The hearing room erupted. The email was devastating. Bongino slowly reread the key line. "I'm not just providing you inside information anymore. I'm literally writing the legislation to move the stocks we own. This is why I fought so hard to become Speaker." He looked directly at Pelosi. "You fought to become Speaker, one of the most powerful positions in American government, so you could write legislation to manipulate stock prices and enrich yourself." He pointed to the final line, "P.S. Delete this after reading. You knew what you were doing was criminal, but you forgot that emails never truly disappear. The FBI recovered this from backup servers." Bongino then displayed a comprehensive chart detailing all the green energy profits. Let me tally up the green energy profits for you. Tesla generated $4.9 million. ChargePoint brought in $847,000. QuantumScape netted $1.3 million. Rivian Commercial Electric Trucks added another $687,000. Various other green energy plays contributed an additional $800,000. The total profit from legislation you wrote, while your husband was positioned to benefit, comes to $8.6 million. He closed the folder. Nancy Pelosi corrupted the legislative process. She wrote bills specifically to move stocks. She used her power as Speaker to manipulate markets for personal gain. That's securities fraud, wire fraud, honest services fraud, and bribery. He then pulled out the next folder. Now, should we discuss Alphabet and the antitrust investigations? Nancy Pelosi's attorney stood up once more. My client is pleading the Fifth Amendment for the rest of this hearing. Smart move, Bonino said, because everything she says can and will be used against her in a criminal case, and based on the evidence, that case is going to land her a very long prison sentence. The former speaker sat there silently. Her hands were clasped, her face gave nothing away. But everyone in that room knew her career was finished, and her freedom was about to end. Let's talk about what happened when Nancy and Paul Pelosi found out they were under investigation, Bongino said, as he opened his sixth folder. Because this is where they turned securities fraud into obstruction of justice. This is where they made everything so much worse. He pulled out a timeline beginning in July 2024. July 14, 2024. The Wall Street Journal publishes an investigative report about congressional stock trading. The article doesn't specifically name Nancy Pelosi, but it describes trading patterns that almost perfectly match what the Pelosis were doing. Bongino showed the article's headline on the screen. July 18, 2024. The FBI officially opens a criminal investigation. And that's when the panic truly began. The mass deletion. He pulled out phone records that showed frantic activity. On July 18, 2024, Nancy made 37 phone calls. Paul made 29. They were calling lawyers, calling each other, calling their staff. They were in full-blown panic mode. Bongino then brought out phone transcripts, acquired through court-authorized wiretaps. By this point, we had obtained FISA warrants. We were listening to absolutely everything. He pulled out a transcript from a phone call on July 18th at 8:47 p.m. It was Nancy to Paul. Nancy, we have a serious problem. The FBI is investigating congressional stock trading. Paul, how bad is this? NY's voice was on the recording. It's bad. They're going to see the pattern. They're going to connect it to my briefings. Paul, what should we do? Nancy, delete everything. Every email where I told you about briefings. Every text. Absolutely everything. Paul, Nancy, that's obstruction. Nancy, I don't care. It's better than them having evidence. Delete it all tonight. The hearing room erupted. That was Nancy Pelosi explicitly ordering the destruction of evidence. Bongino continued. What happened next is textbook obstruction. July 18th, 9:15 p.m. Nancy logs into her email and deletes 12,800 emails. She empties her trash and clears her browser history. July 18th, 9:27 p.m. Paul deletes 8,391 emails and wipes his phone. July 19th, 7:23 a.m. Nancy calls her daughter Christine. 1 hour later, Christine deletes 2,800. A total of 24,085 emails deleted in a coordinated effort to destroy evidence. Bongino smiled faintly as he pulled out recovery reports. But digital evidence never truly vanishes. We recovered everything. Email providers keep backups. The NSA captured some communications. Devices had synced copies. Other recipients still had copies. Result: we recovered 23,981 of the 24,085 deleted emails, a 99.66% recovery rate. The Pelosis tried to destroy evidence. They failed, and they just added federal obstruction charges to their problems. He pulled out more recordings. Nancy also contacted 9 former staff members, attempting to influence their testimony. He played a recording from July 22nd. NY's voice came through the speakers, calling her former chief of staff, Michael Lee. Nancy, Michael, the FBI might ask questions. If they ask whether I discussed classified briefings with Paul, the answer is no. You never heard me discuss briefings with him. None of that happened, Michael. But Nancy, I was there dozens of times when you called Paul right after briefings. Nancy, you didn't hear anything. Your memory is mistaken. If you tell the FBI you heard things, you make yourself complicit. Just say you don't remember. Michael, this sounds like you're asking me to lie. Nancy, I'm asking you to remember correctly. Don't record this conversation. The recording stopped. Bongino looked at the committee. That's witness tampering. Michael Lay immediately called the FBI and agreed to cooperate. He wore a wire for every conversation that followed. He pulled out FBI interview reports. August 12, 2024. FBI agents interviewed Nancy voluntarily. She was informed that lying is a federal crime. She said she understood. Then she lied repeatedly. He read from the transcript, his voice taking on a careful, deliberate tone. The agents asked, "Did you ever provide your husband with information from classified briefings?" Nancy answered, "Absolutely not. Paul manages his own portfolio." "That's a lie. We have emails showing she told him what to buy." The agents asked, "Have you ever deleted communications relevant to this investigation?" Nancy answered, "No, I preserve all official communications." "That's a lie. She had deleted 12,147 emails 3 weeks earlier." Bongino counted on his fingers. 3 direct lies in one interview. Each one is a separate 5-year felony. He snapped the folder shut. Nancy Pelosi had obstructed justice. She had destroyed evidence. She'd even tampered with witnesses. She lied directly to federal agents. She only made everything worse. He then pulled out the final folder, the one labeled indictment. And now, she would face justice. It was September 15, 2024, between 6:00 and 7:00 a.m. 20 FBI agents had surrounded the Pelosi mansion in Pacific Heights. News helicopters were already circling overhead. Someone had clearly leaked the arrest timing, as every network had cameras positioned right on the street. FBI Deputy Director Dan Bongino stood on the front steps, arrest warrants in hand. He had flown all the way from Washington, specifically for this very moment. After 25 years as a cop, this was the one arrest that would define his entire career. He rang the doorbell. Paul Pelosi answered the door in a bathrobe, his eyes still blurry from sleep. The moment he saw the FBI jackets and the wall of agents standing behind Bongino, his face went completely white. "Paul Pelosi," Bongino said, his voice flat and utterly professional. "I have a warrant here for your arrest. You're being charged with securities fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy under the RICO statute. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Paul's hands began to tremble. "I want my lawyer," he uttered. "You'll have access to a lawyer after you've been processed," Bongino replied. "Now, turn around." As agents were cuffing Paul, Bongino stepped into the house. At that exact moment, Nancy Pelosi was coming down the grand staircase, already fully dressed in a navy pantsuit despite the early hour. She had likely been awake all night, knowing this was inevitable. "Nancy Pelosi," Bongino began. He said, "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of securities fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. Do you understand these rights?" As he explained them, Nancy stood perfectly still on the stairs for a long moment, her face an unreadable mask. Decades of political discipline allowed her to maintain her composure even now, but you could see her hands were clenched tightly at her sides. "This is political persecution," she finally said, her voice controlled, yet clearly strained. "This is just the FBI being weaponized." "Ma'am," Bongino interrupted, "you committed crimes." We have the evidence. A grand jury reviewed that evidence, and they issued an indictment. That is how the justice system works. Now, please turn around. For just a moment, Nancy Pelosi, the former Speaker of the House, one of the most powerful women in American political history, stood frozen on her own staircase. Then, slowly, she turned around and allowed the agents to place her in handcuffs. The cameras waiting outside captured everything. It was the image of Nancy Pelosi, age 84, in handcuffs, being walked to a waiting FBI vehicle. That single image would be on every front page in America by noon. Paul, meanwhile, was loaded into a separate vehicle. They were then driven to the FBI field office in San Francisco for booking and processing. By 8 a.m., the news had absolutely exploded across every single platform. CNN ran its breaking news coverage with the Kiran, Pelosi arrested. Fox News showed the perp walk footage on a continuous loop. Over on MSNBC, the anchors looked completely shell-shocked. The New York Times homepage read, Nancy Pelosi charged in $87 million insider trading scheme. The entire political world was thrown into chaos. Democrats were immediately calling it a witch hunt. Republicans, on the other hand, were demanding her immediate expulsion from Congress. Legal analysts everywhere were scrambling to read the indictment. The stock market even dropped 300 points on the news, and Dan Bongino himself held a brief press conference at FBI headquarters, his entire statement lasting less than 2 minutes. Nancy and Paul Pelosi have been arrested and charged with operating a criminal enterprise for the last 15 years. They exploited Nancy's position as Speaker to conduct systematic insider trading that generated $87 million in illegal profits. They then laundered those profits through various shell companies. When they learned they were under investigation, they proceeded to destroy evidence and tamper with witnesses. The FBI doesn't care if you're a member of Congress or just a private citizen. We care about the evidence. And when that evidence shows you've committed crimes, you will be held accountable. His approval ratings would soar to 72% by the end of the week. The grand jury indictment, once it was unsealed later that day, was absolutely devastating. The federal government was charging Nancy and Paul Pelosi with a staggering 41 criminal counts. Each count was detailed separately. Count 1 charged them both under RICO conspiracy for operating a criminal enterprise. The indictment described exactly how Nancy, as Speaker of the House, had access to classified information that could move markets. It detailed how she systematically provided that information to Paul. It showed how Paul executed trades based on that specific information. And it laid out how they laundered the proceeds through a network of shell companies. How they had enriched themselves by $87 million over 15 years. Counts 2 through 348 charged 347 separate instances of securities fraud, one for each illegal trade. The remaining counts covered wire fraud, money laundering, obstruction of justice, witness tampering, false statements to federal investigators, and ethics violations. The prosecution was also seeking the forfeiture of $71.5 million in assets, representing everything the Pelosi's had acquired through their crimes. Legal experts who reviewed the indictment were unanimous. The case was overwhelming. The trial of United States versus Nancy Pelosi and Paul Pelosi began on February 3, 2025, in the United States District Court for the Northern District of California. Judge Haywood Gilliam presided. A careful, methodical jurist, he was known for running complex white-collar crime cases with an iron hand. Selecting an impartial jury took 6 days. Eventually, they seated 12 jurors and 6 alternates, 7 women, 5 men, with ages ranging from 28 to 67, representing diverse political views and backgrounds. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Martinez, a 15-year veteran known for her methodical approach. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about greed and betrayal. Nancy Pelosi was Speaker of the House. She had access to classified information that could move markets. She had the trust of the American people, and she betrayed that trust to enrich herself and her husband. Over the next 7 weeks, you're going to see evidence that Nancy and Paul Pelosi operated a criminal enterprise for 15 years. You're going to see 347 illegal trades. You're going to hear recordings of Nancy telling Paul exactly what to trade. You're going to read emails where she explicitly describes providing insider information. The evidence is overwhelming. The defense opening, delivered by Mark Garagos, was predictably different. The government wants you to believe that Nancy Pelosi, who dedicated 38 years to public service, who was Speaker of the House, is a criminal. But Paul Pelosi is a sophisticated investor who's been investing for 40 years. The fact that some trades happened around the time Nancy attended briefings doesn't prove anything. This is circumstantial evidence and political persecution. At the end of this trial, you'll find Nancy and Paul Pelosi not guilty. Then the government began presenting its case, witness by witness, document by document, building an airtight prosecution. Thomas Hansen, Paul's broker, testified first. He'd been granted immunity in exchange for his cooperation. On the stand, he was devastating. Paul told me directly that Nancy briefed him after classified meetings. He said Nancy knows things before they're public. He said they'd made $80 million this way over the years. I knew it was insider trading. I told him it was illegal. He said they were untouchable, that nobody would investigate the Speaker's husband. The prosecution then played the recordings Hansen had made while cooperating with the FBI. The jury heard Paul's voice on tape. My wife says privacy regulations are coming from the FTC. She was in a briefing yesterday. This is going to move the stock. Nancy tells me everything. Just execute the trade. The defense tried to attack Hansen's credibility on cross-examination. He had immunity. He had every reason to lie to protect himself. But the recordings were undeniable. That was Paul Pelosi's voice admitting to insider trading. Nancy Pelosi's former chief of staff, Michael Lee, testified next, also with immunity. He described how Nancy would emerge from classified briefings and immediately call Paul, telling staff to clear the room so she could have privacy. This happened constantly over the years. Everyone on staff knew what was happening, but nobody said anything because she was the Speaker. She'd come out of a classified FTC briefing about tech regulations, Lee testified, and 30 minutes later, she'd be on the phone with Paul. The next day, we'd see news reports about Paul's tech stock trades. It was obvious what was happening. Lowe also testified about Nancy Pelosi's attempt to get him to lie to the FBI. The jury heard the recording where Nancy told him to say he didn't remember her calling Paul after briefings, where she threatened that telling the truth would make him complicit. The FBI's forensic accountant, Dr. Sarah Chen, spent 3 full days walking the jury through the money. She presented charts showing 347 trades, $180 million in volume, and $87 million in profits. She showed the correlation between Nancy Pelosi's briefings and Paul's trades. 89% of Paul's trades occurred within 2 weeks of Nancy receiving relevant, classified information. The probability of this timing being coincidental, Dr. Chen testified, is less than 1 in 100 million. This wasn't luck. This was clearly systematic insider trading, all based on secret information. The evidence presented was absolutely overwhelming. The prosecution brought forward 147 emails between Nancy and Paul, all discussing trades. The jury read Nancy's own words. Anterior issues coming for Apple. Position accordingly. This is going to move markets. They also heard 89 recorded phone calls where Nancy gave Paul classified information before it was public. They saw 347 trading confirmations that highlighted the suspicious timing. Bank records were reviewed, showing money being laundered through shell companies. They even looked at 24,085 deleted emails that FBI forensic specialists managed to recover. Then, the prosecution revealed Exhibit 47, the undeniable smoking gun email Nancy had sent to Paul in October 2021. It read, "I'm literally writing legislation to move the stocks we own. This is why I fought to become Speaker." When that email flashed across the courtroom screens, several jurors reacted visibly. One slowly shook her head. Another's eyes widened in disbelief. The defense simply had no way to explain it. But the most powerful moment came when Paul Pelosi took the stand for the prosecution. The government had offered Paul a cooperation agreement. If he testified truthfully against Nancy, his recommended sentence would be reduced. Facing the terrifying prospect of dying in prison, Paul accepted the deal. On the stand, Paul looked utterly broken. He couldn't even meet Nancy's eyes. "Mr. Pelosi," the prosecutor asked, "did your wife Nancy provide you with classified information from congressional briefings that you then used to make stock trades?" Paul's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes. For how many years?" 15 years, from 2009 until 2024. "Did she know this was illegal?" "Yes. She told me to delete emails about it. She said we had to be careful because it was insider trading." "Mr. Pelosi, do you still love your wife?" Paul paused, a long, heavy silence. Then he said, "I don't know who she is anymore." Nancy's face remained blank, but she gripped the edge of the defense table so tightly her knuckles turned white. The defense's case was shaky at best. They called character witnesses who swore Nancy was dedicated and ethical, but none knew anything about her trading. They even brought in investment experts who claimed Paul's returns could be chalked up to pure skill. But the prosecution tore them apart on cross-examination, pointing out that Paul's returns were only extraordinary on stocks where Nancy had insider information. Nancy's lawyers advised her not to testify. The risk was just too high, but Nancy insisted. She truly believed she could defend herself. It was a colossal mistake. During cross-examination, the prosecutor completely dismantled her. "Ms. Pelosi, you sent your husband an email saying, 'Move fast' on NVIDIA, just 3 days before his $5 million purchase. You claim you weren't directing his trades. How do you explain that email?" Nancy had no good answer. I may have mentioned news, but you texted him? This is insider information at its finest. OL. That's you explicitly admitting you were providing insider information, correct? That was taken out of context. What context makes that okay, Ms. Pelosi? Silence. After 7 long weeks of trial, the jury deliberated for 9 days. On March 28, 2025, they delivered their verdict. The jury foreman stood. Judge Gilliam asked, "On count 1, RICO conspiracy, how do you find?" "We find both defendants guilty." Nancy's face remained frozen. Paul began to cry quietly. "On count 2, securities fraud." "Guilty." This went on for nearly an hour. The jury had convicted Nancy and Paul Pelosi on almost every single charge. Guilty on RICO conspiracy. Guilty on 341 of 347 securities fraud counts. Guilty on all wire fraud counts. Guilty on all money laundering counts. Guilty on all obstruction counts. When the verdicts were read, Nancy Pelosi, 84 years old, the former Speaker of the House, buried her face in her hands. Paul Pelosi openly sobbed. Judge Gilliam's voice was firm. The defendants are remanded to custody pending sentencing. Sentencing is scheduled for June 2nd. Court is adjourned. U.S. Marshals handcuffed both defendants and escorted them from the courtroom. Nancy Pelosi's political career, 38 years in Congress, multiple terms as Speaker, ended not with applause, but with handcuffs. Outside the courthouse, cameras caught her being led to a marshal's van. She held her head high, her face blank, trying to maintain some dignity even in defeat. But everyone knew her freedom was gone. Her legacy was ruined. And in 3 months, she would find out exactly how much time she'd spend in prison. June 2nd, 2025. Nancy and Paul Pelosi stood before Judge Haywood Gilliam, dressed in orange prison jumpsuits. Nancy spoke first. I'm 84 years old. I dedicated 38 years to public service. I made mistakes. I ask for mercy. Paul said, I trusted my wife. I was wrong. I'm sorry. Judge Gilliam looked over the sentencing report, then started to speak. Ms. Pelosi, you were the Speaker of the House, third in line for the presidency. You had access to highly classified information. You used that access to make $87 million in personal profit. You didn't just trade using insider information. You actually wrote laws designed to shift stock prices in your own portfolio. You turned Congress into your personal money-making machine. When you were caught, you destroyed evidence. You even tampered with witnesses, and you lied to investigators. You showed absolutely no remorse, not until you were convicted. This court is sentencing you to 40 years in federal prison. Even with good behavior, you'll serve at least 34 years. By then, you'll be 118 years old. If you even manage to finish your sentence, you'll likely die right there in prison. On top of that, you're forfeiting $71.5 million in assets. You're also permanently banned from holding federal office and from trading securities. Judge Gilliam then turned his attention to Paul. Mr. Pelosi, this court is sentencing you to 31 years in federal prison. You'll serve at least 26 years of that. You're 82 now. You will likely die in prison. U.S. Marshals then escorted them both away. Nancy Pelosi, the former Speaker, once third in line for the presidency, was now destined to die in a prison cell. Nancy Pelosi arrived at FCI Victorville on June 15, 2025. As inmate number 47382112 at 84 years old, she was assigned to cell C-47, a 10-8-foot concrete box she had to share with 2 other inmates. Neither of them cared that she had once been the Speaker of the House. During her first year, her transformation was both swift and incredibly brutal. The change was truly swift and brutal. On day 4, an inmate who was serving 15 years for armed robbery cornered her in the cafeteria. You stole $87 million while people like me were out stealing just $3,000. You got 40 years. I got 15. Do you know why? Because they finally decided to hold your kind accountable. You're not special in here. You're just another thief, nothing more. Nancy found herself working in the prison library, earning a mere 14 cents per hour. Her very first visitor was her daughter, Christine, who had driven 7 hours all the way from San Francisco. Speaking through plexiglass phones, Christine began to cry. Nancy, however, did not. Mom, you're going to die in here. You're 84 years old. You got 40 years. Nancy's carefully held composure finally cracked. I know, she whispered. Christine never came to visit her again. By the third month, all of Nancy's appeals had been denied. The Ninth Circuit Court ruled that the evidence against her was overwhelming, even including her own emails, which explicitly described her actions as insider trading. Appeal denied. The Supreme Court then declined to hear her case. Her 40-year sentence was now final. By month 12, Nancy had aged dramatically. Her hair was white, she'd lost 30 pounds, and her hands trembled constantly. She ate her meals alone, spoke very little, and became almost like a ghost. A younger inmate once asked her, "Was it really worth it?" The money? Nancy paused for a very long moment. "I thought it was," she replied. "I truly believed power and money were the whole point. I was wrong. I would do everything so differently now." Paul Pelosi's experience at FCI Lompoc was quite different, yet it proved just as devastating. At 82, overweight, diabetic, and suffering from hypertension, he broke down almost immediately upon arrival. His cellmate offered no sympathy whatsoever. "You made $87 million and you're crying? You got 31 years because you actually thought you were untouchable." Well, you're not. In August 2025, Nancy filed for divorce, doing so from prison. She blamed Paul for having testified against her. Paul signed the divorce papers that October. Their divorce was finalized in March of 2026. All of their assets had already been forfeited by then. Their children received absolutely nothing. Paul's health quickly collapsed. In January 2026, he suffered a minor stroke. Then, in June 2026, a major stroke hit, leaving him needing a cane. His petition for compassionate release was denied in April 2027. He made $87 million illegally. He has served only 2 years. Motion denied. On February 14, 2027, Valentine's Day, Paul suffered a catastrophic third stroke. This left him partially paralyzed, unable to speak, and needing 24-hour care. He simply stopped eating, refused all treatment, and eventually just gave up. On November 8, 2027, Paul Pelosi died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 84. He had served only 2 years and 5 months of his 31-year sentence. His body was cremated at the county's expense. Not a single one of his children claimed the ashes. The San Francisco Chronicle carried his obituary. Paul Pelosi, 84, dies in prison. No services planned. Nancy received the news from a prison chaplain. She showed absolutely no emotion. "I see," she said. "Thank you." But later that night, her cellmate heard her crying. The next day, Nancy told the prison psychologist, "Paul was my husband for 43 years, and I feel absolutely nothing. I think I've been dead inside for such a long time." The 5 Pelosi children reacted to their parents' convictions by completely vanishing from public life. One daughter moved to Portugal in August 2025, using only her married name. She changed her social media profiles, removed all photos with her mother, and refused every interview request. By 2026, she had simply vanished. Her own marriage ended due to the immense stress. The other 4 children similarly fled from their public lives. Paul Jr. changed his name to Paul Roth and relocated to Colorado. Alexandra moved to London and completely stopped making political documentaries. Jacqueline and Nancy Karen changed their names and moved to different states. None visited their parents after the first few months. When Paul Jr. wrote back once, he said, "You and Mom destroyed our family. The Pelosi name is poison. I changed my name. My kids don't know you're their grandfather. Please don't write again." The Pelosi dynasty once powerful, was shattered. The day after sentencing, Dan Bongino, still serving as FBI Deputy Director, held his only press conference on the case. This investigation was about evidence, not politics. Nancy Pelosi exploited her office to generate $87 million in illegal profits. She corrupted the legislative process. When caught, she destroyed evidence and lied to investigators. If a Republican committed the same crimes, the result would be identical. The FBI serves the Constitution, not a political party. Some say the sentence was too harsh. I disagree. She committed these crimes into her 80s. She never stopped until we caught her. This sends a message. No one is above the law. Not the Speaker. Not after 38 years. Not even at 84. The polls showed 73% overall approval, 93% among Republicans, 71% Independents, 46% Democrats. Bongino declined all book deals, speaking engagements, and media jobs. He continued as FBI Deputy Director. 3 months later, the FBI announced new investigations into 3 other members of Congress based on evidence from the Pelosi case. His former partner called, "You could retire now. Write your ticket anywhere." Bongino's response, "The work isn't done. Pelosi wasn't the only corrupt member, just the most powerful we caught. There are others. I became a cop to catch criminals. There are more criminals to catch." The Pelosi case triggered the most comprehensive congressional ethics reform since Watergate. Within 2 weeks of sentencing, bipartisan legislation was introduced in both chambers. The Pelosi Accountability Act contained 7 major provisions. First, a complete ban on individual stock trading by members of Congress, their spouses, and dependent children. Only diversified mutual funds or blind trusts would be permitted. Second, real-time financial disclosure within 24 hours instead of the previous 45-day window. Third, a new 50-agent FBI Congressional Ethics Enforcement Division focused exclusively on investigating corruption. Fourth, mandatory minimum sentences of 10 years for insider trading by members of Congress. Fifth, no statute of limitations for corruption offenses. Sixth, all classified briefings would be recorded and cross-referenced with trading activity. And seventh, enhanced whistleblower protections with financial incentives for congressional staffers who report corruption. The vote House for WV8, 94-3. President Biden signed it July 4, 2025, at the National Archives. This ensures no member can exploit classified information for gain. This is not a Democratic or Republican bill. This is an American bill. The impact, or 847 congressional stock trades, 2025, 531 trades, 89%, drop. Most members completely divested. 3 were indicted in 2020. Senator Burr, 8 years. Senator Leeler, 12 years. Representative Cooper, 6 years. Polling, December 2025. 78% approved of the act. 82% said members shouldn't trade individual stocks. 67% said corrupt officials will be held accountable, up from 23% before Pelosi. The case had a profound cultural impact across American institutions. In law schools, every major institution added United States versus Pelosi to their curriculum. Harvard created a full semester course on the case. Yale law professors used her emails as teaching materials, telling students, "This is his textbook science." She knew it was illegal and did it anyway. Business schools followed suit. Stanford added a case study on the Pelosi trading scheme. Wharton created a module asking students, "Nancy made $87 million illegally. Cost. Both died in prison. Marriage ended. Children disowned them. Legacy destroyed. Was it worth it?" The FBI Academy made the case the centerpiece of financial crimes training for new agents. In popular culture, the case spawned numerous books, including Bob Woodward's The Speaker and the Trader, and Thomas Hansen's memoir, The Pelosi Portfolio. Netflix produced an 8-part documentary series. A TikTok video analyzing the case got 47 million views, with the observation she got $2.5 million per year to go to prison. Most people would take that deal. The phrase, "getting Pelosi," entered American political slang. Whenever someone tried to use power to evade consequences, people would say, "Remember Nancy Pelosi? She thought she was untouchable. She died in prison." By NY's second year in prison, she had become unrecognizable. Her prison medical evaluation documented the dramatic decline. Her weight had plummeted to 98 pounds from 128 at intake. She'd been diagnosed with congestive heart failure and early-stage Alzheimer's disease. The psychological assessment noted, "The inmate has given up on life." When asked about her condition, she stated, "What would be the point? I'm already dead." She received mostly hate mail. There was only one letter of support, from her sister. Her sister wrote, "We grew up with nothing. Dad taught us to serve." "What happened to you?" Nancy wrote back once. "I don't know what happened to me either." Her sister never wrote again. November 3, 2026. It was Election Day. Nancy attempted suicide by hoarding heart medications. Her cellmate found her unconscious at 3:30 a.m. Prison doctors saved her. Her first words when she woke were, "Why did you save me?" She was placed in solitary confinement as punishment, then under 24-hour observation. The isolation only made everything worse. By 2028, Nancy was 87 years old. Her Alzheimer's had significantly progressed. She frequently didn't remember she was in prison, often asking guards, "When can I go to my office?" She was then transferred to Federal Medical Center Carswell in Texas, sitting in a wheelchair most days, staring at nothing. No visitors, no friends, no family. Her final interview came in April 2028. A journalist from The Atlantic interviewed her for a long-form piece. "Do you understand why you're in prison?" "I made mistakes. I took money." "Do you feel remorse?" "I feel tired. Very, very tired." "Would you do things differently?" Her answer was emotional. "I had everything. Speaker of the House, powerful, respected, a family, a legacy, and I threw it all away for money I didn't even need. We were already wealthy, but it wasn't enough. I always wanted more. Now I have nothing. My husband is dead. My children won't speak to me. My name is corruption. Was it worth it? No." The article concluded, "Nancy Pelosi will die in prison." When asked what she wanted to be remembered for, she said, "Remember that power corrupts, that greed destroys. Remember me as a warning." The Pelosi case became definitive, ranked with Watergate and Abscam as a pivotal moment against corruption. Congressional trading was down 91% by 2030. Pelosi became permanent slang. Every candidate was forced to pledge no individual trading. Harvard University Press, 2032. It was a turning point. Even the most powerful could now be held accountable. Before Pelosi, insider trading was an open secret. The system protected its own. After Pelosi, zero tolerance, aggressive investigations, and prison time. The lesson was clear. No one is above the law. FBI Headquarters, Washington, D.C. Inside Dan Bongino's office. Dan Bongino sat at his desk, reviewing files for yet another congressional corruption investigation. Another representative. More suspicious crypto trades. More classified AI briefings. The work never seemed to end. His phone rang. It was his former NYPD partner, the same one who always called with news. "Danny, did you see the news? Nancy Pelosi died this morning." Bongino leaned back in his chair. He'd been expecting this call for months. "Heart failure?" "Yeah, passed away in her sleep at the prison medical facility in Texas. She was 90 years old, serving 5 years of her 40-year sentence." There was a pause on the line. "You're going to make a statement?" "No," Bongino said. "Nancy Pelosi's death isn't news. Her death was inevitable the day she was sentenced. The real news was 5 years ago, when she was held accountable for her crimes. That's when the story ended. The media is already running retrospectives, the rise and fall of Nancy Pelosi." "You sure you don't want to comment?" "What would I say? That I'm sorry she's dead? I'm not. She committed serious crimes. She was prosecuted. She was convicted. She served part of her sentence and died in prison. That's justice. That's how the system is supposed to work. Some people are saying the prosecution was too harsh, that she shouldn't have died in prison." "Some people are wrong," Bongino replied, his voice firm. Nancy Pelosi had access to classified information that could move markets. She exploited that access for 15 years. She made $87 million. She corrupted her office. When she was caught, she destroyed evidence, tampered with witnesses, and lied to federal agents. She showed no remorse until she was convicted. The sentence was appropriate. The fact that she died in prison is a consequence of her age and her crimes, not of judicial cruelty. She was 84 when sentenced. She committed crimes into her 80s. What did people expect? Fair enough. Are you working on anything new? Bongino looked at the files on his desk. Always. 3 current investigations, 2 senators, 1 representative. Similar patterns of trading on information from classified briefings. They thought the Pelosi case was a one-off. They thought they could be more careful. They were wrong. Did Congress learn anything? Most members learned. Congressional trading is down 91% from pre-Pelosi levels. The FBI, with its Congressional Ethics Division, had 47 active investigations underway. Public confidence in governmental accountability had soared significantly. The overall outcome? A lasting, profound impact on ethics reform. You see, the Pelosi case truly taught America a crucial lesson that absolutely needed to be learned. Nobody, and I mean nobody, stands above the law. Not even the Speaker of the House herself. Not after dedicating 38 years of public service. Not even if you're a remarkable 84 years old. Not even if you were, at one point, 3rd in line for the presidency of the United States. If you dare to exploit your high office for personal gain, then you will be investigated thoroughly. If the evidence presented is utterly overwhelming, you will face conviction. If your transgressions are truly serious, you will indeed go to prison. And if by then you're quite old, well, you just might die there. That's not some act of cruelty. That, my friends, is pure accountability. And so, 5 years after Nancy Pelosi's conviction, a full 10 years after her reign of corruption finally came to an end, accountability was truly working. Now, congressional corruption hadn't simply vanished into thin air. It probably never would completely disappear. But it had, without a doubt, decreased dramatically. Members of Congress were keenly aware they were being constantly watched. They understood that the FBI would swiftly investigate any suspicious activity. They also knew there was a real chance they could end up just like Nancy Pelosi. And for most of them, that simply wasn't worth the immense risk. Then, on November 15, 2030, merely 3 days after Nancy Pelosi's passing, the FBI's Congressional Ethics Enforcement Division proudly announced the indictment of Senator Marcus Williams, a Democrat from New York, for insider trading. His actions were based on classified briefings he'd received about upcoming AI regulation. The damning evidence even included emails where Williams had specifically told his financial advisor, and I quote, "The AI regs are definitely coming. Short the tech stocks now, trust me." Predictably, the case was promptly assigned to the very same prosecutors who had expertly handled the Pelosi case years prior. Senator Williams's attorney, seeing the writing on the wall, immediately began discussing a possible plea deal. The wheels of justice just kept on turning, because Dan Bongino, it turned out, was absolutely right. He'd said, "In Washington, D.C., corruption never sleeps, but neither does the cop." And after the impactful Pelosi case, the good guys, the cops, were undeniably winning. Bongino thought, "I really like what I do. But there's simply too much work to be done. Corruption doesn't ever retire, so neither, he decided, would I." They finished their conversation, then hung up the phone. Bongino, ever vigilant, returned to sifting through his files. Another senator, another potential case, another troubling pattern, and another full-blown investigation. Because in Washington, D.C., corruption, as we all know, truly never sleeps. But, thankfully, neither does the cop.